What if I told you that in 1974, the Grateful Dead hit a breaking point at the height of their touring power, while other bands were chasing stadium glory? Garcia was exhausted by what the band had become. The same year they unveiled the most advanced sound system in rock history, they nearly went bankrupt because of it. This is the story of how a 75-ton wall of sound almost destroyed the Grateful Dead, and how walking away saved them. To understand why, you need to understand what the Grateful Dead had become by 1974. They were hauling a sound system that weighed as much as a dozen full-grown elephants and stretched the length of a basketball court. The wall of sound had over 600 speakers and cost almost $300,000 to build. For context, that's over $1.5 million in today's money. Merl Stanley, the band's sound engineer and LSD chemist, had created a monster. The system required 4 semi-trailers and 2 road crews just to transport it. They had achieved perfect sound quality, but at what cost? By mid-74, management was starting to be like, hey guys, we can't do things like we did in the early days. They were hemorrhaging money. But the financial pressure was only part of the story. The stresses of large-scale touring, the loss of Pigpen, and too many gigs and people backstage led them to decide to take some time off. Phil Lesh would later reflect that the chaos had become unsustainable. What most fans didn't realize was that Jerry Garcia was burning out in real time. By the end of 1974, Jerry was done being that kind of hero. He was ready for a change of scene. He needed a break from it. The band agreed it was time to pause. There was a collective sigh of relief at the end of 1974 when they were like, okay, you know what? Let's take a break here. So the Grateful Dead announced their farewell. 5 concerts at Winterland in San Francisco, October 16th through 20th, 1974. These weren't just any shows. They were being filmed for what would become the Grateful Dead movie. The band nearly bankrupted themselves making that film too. The set list for those final shows read like a greatest hits collection. Playing in the band, Eyes of the World, and they closed each night with Johnny Be Good. Bob Weir thanked the crowd and hinted at the hiatus, but nobody really knew what was coming next. Here's where the story gets interesting though. Jerry Garcia didn't actually stop playing music. Just weeks after the farewell shows, he was back on stage. November 5th, 1974. The Bottom Line in New York City. Garcia was jamming with Merl Saunders, playing covers like I Second That Emotion and Money Honey, and sitting at a table near the stage, John Lennon. This tells us something crucial about Garcia's mindset. He wasn't done with music. He was tired of the machinery that came with being in the Dead. The wall of sound, the massive crew, the financial pressure, the expectations. He wanted to get back to just playing music with friends. For most of 1975, the Grateful Dead stayed quiet. Garcia played with the Jerry Garcia Band and explored acoustic bluegrass with Old and in the Way. Bob Weir built a home studio called Ace's Studios, where he worked on solo material. But something was brewing behind the scenes. Then came the snack benefit. March 23, 1975, Kezar Stadium in San Francisco. Students need athletics, culture, and kicks. A fundraiser for San Francisco schools. Bill Graham explained it simply. We make our living from the youth of San Francisco. This is one way we hope to thank them. Here's what's fascinating about that show. The Grateful Dead played for only 45 minutes, and their entire set was basically one song. Blues for Allah. Blues for Allah into Stronger Than Dirt, or Milk and the Turkey, into drums, back to the reprise, and an encore of Johnny Be Good. Fans who expected a marathon Dead show got experimental jazz fusion instead. That performance was a preview of what the band had been working on during their break. Recording at Weir's home studio with minimal overdubs, exploring unusual instrumentation like gongs and hand percussion. The hiatus had given them space to experiment without the pressure of touring. Garcia told a radio interviewer that the break gave them space to explore, and that Blues for Allah was an experiment, but the real comeback was still months away. August 13th, 1975, the Great American Music Hall in San Francisco. This was invitation only, about 1,000 people total, and it was where the Grateful Dead debuted Help on the Way, Slipknot, Franklin's Tower. That sequence would become one of their most beloved song suites. The show also featured King Solomon's Marbles, Crazy Fingers, and Blues for Allah. It was recorded and later released as One from the Vault, capturing the intimacy of their return. Garcia's guitar tone was cleaner, more focused than the Wall of Sound era. Notice what it changed though. The jams from 1974, like Playing in the Band and Eyes of the World, had evolved into structured suites. Help on the Way flowed seamlessly into Slipknot, then into Franklin's Tower. The rhythm section had refined percussion compositions during the break. This wasn't just the same band returning, this was musical evolution. By June 1976, the Grateful Dead were ready to tour again. But here's the beautiful irony. They realized they didn't need to carry that massive equipment with them anymore. By the time they came back from their hiatus, the world of audio had caught up to them. They could rent a PA system and achieve the same quality without the financial burden. The Wall of Sound had been a magnificent obsession, but it had nearly destroyed them. The 1974 break wasn't about quitting, it was about recovery. Garcia needed to step back from being that kind of hero. The band needed to reset their finances, and their music needed room to evolve. Looking back, that year off might have been the smartest decision the Grateful Dead ever made. They returned with simpler logistics but more sophisticated music. The Blues for Allah sessions had pushed them into jazz fusion territory. Help on the Way and Franklin's Tower became fan favorites that they'd play for the next 30 years. But perhaps most importantly, they learned they could step away and come back. That break established a precedent that would serve them well through lineup changes, creative challenges, and Garcia's later struggles. The Grateful Dead weren't just a band. They were a living organism that could adapt and survive. The Wall of Sound only lasted 1 year, but its legacy shaped how every major rock band thinks about concert audio. Stadium sound systems today trace their lineage back to Bear Stanley's revolutionary ideas. The Dead proved that sometimes you have to nearly destroy something to understand what it really is. Jerry Garcia never really quit the Grateful Dead. He just needed to remember why he loved playing music in the first place. That Bottom Line show with John Lennon watching from the audience wasn't an ending, it was a reminder. Music isn't about the machinery, it's about the connection between players and audience. The 1974 to 76 period taught the Grateful Dead that sustainability matters more than spectacle. They could tour for 30 more years because they learned when to step back. The Wall of Sound was incredible, but it was also unsustainable. Garcia's call for a break probably saved the band's career. There's one more piece to this story that most people miss. The Wall of Sound wasn't just about volume or clarity. It was about Bear Stanley's vision of perfect reproduction. Each instrument had its own dedicated speakers, creating what Stanley called a sonic democracy. But democracy is expensive, and perfection has a price. The technical specifications were staggering. 641 speakers, arranged in a precise geometric pattern. 11 separate channels with individual mixing capabilities. The system could produce 126,000 watts of continuous power. To put that in perspective, most rock bands today use systems a fraction of that size. But here's what made the Dead's situation unique. They weren't just using the Wall of Sound for concerts. They were pioneering live recording techniques that wouldn't become standard until decades later. Those Winterland shows weren't just farewell concerts, they were essentially movie shoots. The band was simultaneously performing, being filmed, and recording a live album. The pressure was immense. Garcia later admitted in interviews that he felt like they were performing for posterity, not just for the audience that night. Every mistake would be preserved on film. Every musical moment had to be perfect. It's no wonder he needed to step back and remember what playing music felt like without cameras rolling. The John Lennon encounter at the bottom line reveals something crucial about Garcia's state of mind. Here was one of the most famous musicians in the world, sitting in a small club, watching Garcia play covers with a friend. No wall of sound, no film crew, no pressure, just music for music's sake. Steve Parrish, the Dead's longtime roadie, remembered that night as a turning point for Garcia's perspective. The snack benefit performance tells another part of the story. When the Dead finally returned to the stage in March 1975, they chose to play for charity. Bill Graham's explanation about giving back to San Francisco's youth wasn't just promotional speak. It reflected the band's values. They had made their money from young fans, and now they wanted to support those same communities. But that 45-minute set was also a musical statement. By playing almost entirely new material, they signaled that this wasn't just the old Grateful Dead returning. Blues for Allah represented a different approach to composition and improvisation. The song structures were more complex, the rhythms more adventurous. It was as if the break had allowed them to absorb influences from jazz, world music, and experimental composition. The financial lessons were equally important. By 1976, when they resumed full touring, the Dead had learned to balance ambition with sustainability. They still wanted great sound, but they didn't need to own and transport their own system. Renting equipment turned out to be both cheaper and more flexible than Bear's elaborate setup. This shift in philosophy extended beyond just sound systems. The band learned that stepping back didn't mean giving up, it meant gaining perspective. Garcia's side projects during the hiatus, from the Jerry Garcia Band to his acoustic work with Old and In the Way, kept him musically active while relieving the pressure of being the Grateful Dead's leader. Weir's solo work and studio experiments gave him space to develop as a songwriter and producer. Perhaps most importantly, the hiatus proved that the Grateful Dead were bigger than any single element of their operation. They could survive without Pigpen, they could function without the wall of sound, and they could take breaks without losing their audience. The Deadheads who showed up at the Great American Music Hall in August 1975 weren't there for the spectacle. They were there for the music and the community. That intimacy became a crucial part of the Dead's identity moving forward. Yes, they would play massive stadiums and festivals for the next 20 years, but they never forgot the lesson of that small venue comeback show. The connection between band and audience mattered more than the size of the sound system. So the next time someone tells you Jerry Garcia quit the Grateful Dead, remind them what actually happened. He didn't quit music. He quit the unsustainable parts of being in a famous band. He stepped away from 75 tons of speakers and came back with better songs. That's not quitting, that's evolution. And it's exactly what the music needed.